I'm Kyle with Fundamentals of Finance, and today we're going to talk about what's causing food and baby formula shortages and when might things go back to normal. Food shortages are quite possibly the biggest global problem you haven't heard about. Maybe even more important than the Johnny Depp trial, and it could get worse. In the US, there's also a major shortage of baby formula. Today, we'll get into detail about what's causing these shortages and when things might go back to normal. Keep in mind, this is not financial advice and is my opinion only. By the way, while we're gonna be talking about food and baby formula, there are two other valuable lessons I hope you take away from this. In the food section, you'll get a glimpse into one of the things I find most fascinating about investing. Everything is connected. Then, in the baby formula section, you'll see some of the perils of curbing free trade through policies that may sound like a good idea when politicians spin them the right way, but can have some major consequences. Let's start with food. As bad as things are in the US, where your favorite cereal might be out of stock and the prices of a lot of things have gone up, these are first world problems. The situation is much more dire in many other places and could get even worse globally before it gets better. Mass famine and political instability aren't out of the question, and it wouldn't be the first time. It was only about 12 years ago when a spike in grain prices led to massive protest in the Arab Spring, which toppled dictators and drastically changed the political landscape in the Middle East. As we stand now in June 2022, a multitude of factors from COVID-19 to climate change to the energy shock and now the war in Ukraine have led to one of the worst wheat supply shocks since World War I, along with shortages and many other key ingredients needed to feed the world. So how did we get here? Well, like I said up front, everything is connected and there are many factors at play. The war in Ukraine is one of them. It's arguably the biggest one, but similar to how I showed you that there are lots of other causes of the rise in gas prices in my video on that, it's naive and or just simply lazy to blame the whole thing on the war. Maybe that's good enough for the major news outlets, but I don't have a political agenda and I actually understand investing. To show you what I mean, you can see in this chart from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization that food prices really started rising in 2020 and then surpassed their 10-year high in 2021. But Russia didn't invade Ukraine until 2020, so clearly we can't blame the war for all of it. Before the war began, the World Food Program, which helps provide food for the world's poor, said that 2022 was going to be even worse for world hunger than 2021, which was a record-setting year. So to understand how we got here, let's first look at weather. By the way, I'm about the furthest thing you could be from a farmer, but I did go to Texas A&M, which is an agricultural school, so I do know some basics by association. One that's most important to note here is that crops are not like cars or electronics. If Ford has to shut down a plant this month, they can still make cars next month that will be just as good. Crops depend on seasons, so if you miss your opportunity to get things planted at the right time one year, next year's harvest might not be nearly as good. You can't just do it later because the climate might not be quite right. That's why unpredictable weather can have such a big impact, and the effects may not be felt right away. Heavy rain in 2021 delayed the planting of wheat in China, which is the world's largest producer, leading them to say that this year's crop could be the worst one of all time. On the other extreme, a heat wave this year in India, which is the world's second largest producer, is also hurting production. So much so that they placed a ban on exports in May, though they said they would make exceptions for some of the neediest countries. There have also been droughts in areas of Europe and the US that produce a lot of wheat. So most of the world has either been experiencing extreme rain, extreme droughts, or extreme heat, essentially all at the same time. Welcome to climate change. COVID-19 also began raising food prices around the world back in 2020 due to supply chain disruptions, which were made even worse by labor shortages and rising shipping costs. Most of these issues have gotten worse as a result of the war in Ukraine. Of the amount that's traded between countries, Russia and Ukraine together supply about 28% of the wheat, 15% of the corn, and 75% of the sunflower oil. The war's had many direct effects on food prices and also many indirect ones. Russia is trying to destroy Ukraine's economy, so they've targeted grain elevators and fertilizer plants to destroy Ukrainian infrastructure. Many farms in the war areas have been decimated by artillery, and those that haven't might not have had anyone left to plant or harvest the crops since so many people have either fled or joined the fighting. Even if the farm is okay and there's someone left to work it, it's become very hard to get things like fuel, which are required to run the farms. Another really serious issue is the loss of the ports in the Black Sea, especially the one in Odessa. That's where 98% of Ukrainian grain was exported from, and they're essentially closed, with nearly 100 ships from other countries now trapped. Some have even been sunk. Taking the Black Sea ports would be key to Russia's effort to destroy the Ukrainian economy. So right at the beginning of the war, they began positioning themselves to attack from there. In response, Ukraine put a bunch of mines under the water to keep Russian ships out. Unfortunately, this keeps all ships from going in or out, including the ones that would export food products. As far as Russian food exports, they've still mostly gotten out, but even though none of the sanctions target food, they've still been limited because there are simply many companies that do not want to do business with Russia anymore. Those indirect impacts also extend to energy, since Russia is the world's largest exporter of natural gas and second largest exporter of oil. Some sanctions have targeted these, and prices have risen accordingly. That doesn't just impact what you pay at the pump, it impacts almost everything. Pesticides are produced with hydrocarbons, so their prices have gone up. Diesel to run farm equipment has gone up. They're also one of the leading producers of fertilizer, so those prices are going up. Everything is connected. Going forward, I wish I could say that these things will get better soon, and there is some hope, but the more likely scenario is that they get worse first, and it could take years to resolve this. Ukraine is running out of places to store the food they produce. If the ports in the Black Sea aren't open soon, millions of tons of food will rot, and millions of people around the world could starve to death. The UN said that nearly 250 million people are on the brink of famine. By contrast, an estimated 6.3 million people have died from COVID-19. Some say Putin may not want to be blamed for causing a global hunger crisis, so I suppose there's some hope that they are right. But thus far, he's just tried to use the ports as a bargaining chip, saying they'll allow agricultural ships passage if Ukraine demines the waters and the US drops sanctions. Except the US is probably not going to drop sanctions for that, and Ukraine doesn't really want to demine their waters, because then what's going to stop Russia from attacking there? Some have suggested maybe NATO could send in Navy fleets to defend merchant ships. But if NATO and Russia start fighting, it's World War III. Since no one wants that, I'm not sure how useful NATO ships would be for defense if they're not willing to shoot back. Can Ukraine just export their stuff some other way? Well, I've seen varying estimates of how much that could be, but the highest one I've seen is 20%. So that really wouldn't be enough. There are some things that can be substituted, like the Western governments could remove the requirements of how much fuel from crops has to be used in gasoline, and farmers could feed their cows more grass instead of corn. But those things can only go so far. Could other producers make more? Possibly. And you'd think that with wheat prices so high, it would incentivize them to do so. But the reality is that with the cost of inputs like diesel and fertilizer going up so much, the profitability of producing more wheat might still be down. The potential for wild swings in prices also makes it a little less appealing for farmers to invest a ton in a big crop next year. Also, remember, it takes time for something that's planted to grow. So war-torn fields in Ukraine this year means less will be planted, extending the food shortage into next year. Futures markets show that wheat prices are expected to stay high until next summer. If the war continues, fertilizer shortages could get worse too, since Russia is a big producer. Less fertilizer means things don't grow as well, and there's less food next year. And while Russia may not have any issues with the supply of fertilizer, they could have issues getting all the pesticides and seeds they need, many of which are imported from Europe. A few smaller natural gas producers, like Nigeria and Qatar, have started building nitrogen plants to help out, since nitrogen is made using natural gas and nitrogen fertilizers are the most commonly used types in the world. But that probably won't replace the lost production from Russia. So if this has seemed like a lot to connect all these pieces, I'd put it like this. Issues related to weather and COVID-19 led to higher food prices, and the war in Ukraine led them higher still, both by blocking the export of more food and by further worsening some of the cost-increasing supply shortages of key inputs. The reason food prices are likely to stay high for a while is because you have to plant crops months in advance, and a lot of them are either being planted less efficiently because of fertilizer or pesticide shortages, are not being planted at all due to the war in Ukraine. More expensive inputs like fertilizer and fuel make all agriculture more expensive. So food prices could stay high for some time. How could this lead to political instability? Admittedly, this is a little advanced, even compared to the rest of this video, but I'll do my best to explain. It starts with the fact that people in emerging market countries spend an average of about 25% of their income on food, even more in some of the poorest countries. So from that alone, rising food prices could hurt them more than people in rich countries. But the effect gets compounded because higher inflation leads to higher interest rates in rich countries like the US. For example, rising food prices represented about 13% of the 8.3% inflation rate in the US over the past year, which has been the main reason the Fed has been increasing interest rates. Are you still with me? Higher interest rates strengthen currencies. So if the dollar is getting stronger, it means other currencies are getting weaker at the same time that the prices of those things are already going up. That can put some poor countries in a bind. Allowing your currency to weaken and make food and energy much more expensive when they're already barely affordable is clearly not ideal. But if they decide to defend their currency, that can hurt them in different ways. They can either raise their own country's interest rates, which increases borrowing costs for farmers and everyone else, or they can defend their currency by using their foreign exchange reserves or savings in other currencies to buy more of their own currency, thus driving the price of their currency up. Remember, it's all about supply and demand. So if Mexico has a lot of US dollars, they can sell those US dollars to buy pesos. That's selling activity in dollars and buying activity in pesos, or more supply of dollars and more demand for pesos, which drives up the value of the peso. The problem with this is that countries only have so many foreign exchange reserves, and if they're using their reserves or their savings to defend their currency, then they'll have less left over to subsidize food or energy prices, which essentially means helping their citizens pay for them. So if they let their currency weaken, that's bad. If they defend it by raising interest rates, that's bad. If they defend it with foreign exchange reserves, that's bad. There's really no great option for governments to take, which is why the risk of social unrest goes up when there are rising food and energy prices. While no one is insulated from rising food and energy prices, most US and other rich country citizens are probably going to experience something more in line with an inconvenience than a crisis. But we're one or two poorly timed natural disasters away from something much worse. The baby formula shortage is a different story. That's really a US problem, and there are no weather events or foreign governments to blame. This is also a mini lesson on the value of free trade and the perils of protectionism, which is when governments make rules that distort the market to benefit the companies in their own country. The media often blames pandemic supply chain issues and a recall this year by one of the largest producers, Abbott Nutrition. They had to shut a plant down due to concerns about bacterial infections that were reported in 4 infants. That's gotten a lot of press, but all the baby formula in the US didn't come from that one factory. The real issue is government regulations that have created a distorted market. First, there are strict regulations that prevent most overseas imports. Only about 2% of the formula is typically imported. The dairy industry lobbied for them. The government might say it's safety related, but when a product can be banned for having the wrong size scoop, you can call me a skeptic on that one. Some of the world's largest producers of baby formula are in Europe, and their formula seems safe enough for babies in Europe and all around the world, but it's been hard to get supply into the US because of the restrictions. The second issue is the Women, Infants, and Children, or WIC program, WIC, that helps low-income families get free formula. That sounds pretty noble, right? How could that be bad? Well, it certainly has done a lot of people a lot of good. I'm not denying that. But the problem is that it allows companies to bid to become the sole provider of baby formula for women in a particular state, which basically creates a monopoly in each state for families who use the program. Companies basically give away baby formula to the states because they know that if they control that much of the market, they get better shelf space, more name recognition, and more sales to people who aren't using the WIC program, where the money is made. If you're on food stamps and they don't have any apples, you can just buy oranges. But because the WIC program allows exclusive contracts, it basically kills the competition in each state. Then you do leave yourself vulnerable to one factory causing major issues, although that narrative is still being blown way out of proportion. Unlike the food crisis, the government could fix this one pretty quickly if they wanted to. Relax the rules, allow the imports in, and your problem is solved in a couple weeks. To their credit, they have done a little bit of that, and the FDA has continued loosening regulations in May. It'll take a little time, but between that and the Abbott factory getting back up and running in early June, pressures should at least start to ease by the end of July. How long it takes to get all the way back to normal will depend largely on how far they're willing to go to loosen regulations and let foreign formula in, but we're on the right track. So, I'm sorry to have been such a downer on food prices, but I think at least with baby formula, things should start getting better soon and a return to normal is very much in sight. If you really want to learn how to invest, check out my free webinar below called The 9 Habits of Successful Investors. The link is in the description. Also, if you have any questions or any comments, please put them in the comments below because I do respond to all comments. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.